Hey guys, tonight we're going back to a small town in central Pennsylvania, to a case that has sat unsolved for more than a decade, and to a young woman named Kortne Stouffer. She was 21 years old. She lived in a modest apartment on the main street of Palmyra, a quiet borough in Lebanon County, and in the early morning hours of a Sunday in late July of 2012, she vanished from inside that apartment. She left behind her car, parked outside with the windows down. She left behind her keys and her shoes on the stair landing, right where she always set them. She left behind her purse with her cigarettes and her money and her cell phone still inside it, sitting next to her bed. And she left behind her dog. To this day, no one has seen or heard from her again. Before we settle in for this one, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely find value in what we do here. No pressure and no guilt. And thank you, truly, for all of the case suggestions that keep coming in. We're now on Spotify as well, so the link is in the description if you would rather listen there. Now, dim the lights and get comfortable. This is a long one, and Kortne's story deserves to be heard carefully from the beginning without any rush. She was the kind of person people describe with their whole face, loud, in the best possible way, a free spirit who loved the water and the outdoors and reggae music and a good day spent floating down a slow creek with the people she loved. Her family still gathers on that creek every summer in her honor because it was one of her favorite things in the world. And to understand what happened, we need to go back. Have you ever wondered how a person can disappear without a trace from their own home, in the middle of the night, in a town where everyone seems to know everyone? Have you ever wondered what it means when the last confirmed contact anyone had with a missing woman was not with a friend or a stranger, but with the police themselves? And have you ever wondered how a case with so many people close by, so many witnesses awake and watching, could still end with no answer at all? To understand any of it, we first need to know who Kortne was. Kortne Ciera Stouffer grew up on a farm outside of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, in the kind of wide, green, unhurried landscape that shapes a certain kind of person. Rolling fields, long summer evenings, animals to care for and space to roam. Her parents, Scott and Wendy, raised her and her siblings there. And though Scott and Wendy would divorce in 2005, when Kortne was a young teenager, the family stayed close. That closeness matters to this story, because it is the reason her absence was noticed so quickly, and it is the reason that all these years later, the people who love her have never once stopped looking. You're on that farm in the summertime. The grass is high and the air is thick and warm. Somewhere nearby a dog is barking, and a young girl with a wide, easy laugh is chasing after it, barefoot, already the loudest and the brightest thing in the field. That was Kortne. Her younger sister, Kerstin, would later describe her as carefree and very loud, an energetic, lively, happy-go-lucky person who is always the life of whatever room or field or party she happened to be standing in. She was always trying to put a smile on your face, Kerstin said. She was a loving, kind human being, and when you listen to the people who knew her talk about her, that word comes up again and again. Kind, warm, the first to reach out, the first to include the person standing alone at the edge of the group. By the summer of 2012, Kortne was 21, and she was doing what a lot of 21-year-olds do. She was trying to figure out who she was going to be. Her mother, Wendy, would later put it gently. Kortne was a typical 21-year-old at that point in time, she said. She was trying to figure out what she wanted to be and what direction she wanted to take in life, and the two directions Kortne was drawn to were both things she genuinely loved: beauty and animals. She held down more than one job at once, which tells you something about her on its own. She worked at a salon and spa, doing the kind of work that let her make people feel good about themselves. She worked as a pet groomer, gentle and patient with animals in a way that came naturally to a farm kid. And she worked at times for her father's company as well. It was not a glamorous life. It was a young person's life, stitched together from part-time hours and small paychecks and big, unformed dreams. Which is to say, it was ordinary, in the way that so many of these stories are ordinary right up until the moment they stop being ordinary at all. She carried her personality on her skin too, the way a lot of people her age do. On her right arm, she had a tattoo that read, "One Love," 2 words that could have been the whole summary of how she moved through the world. On the top of her right foot, 3 small stars, and on her left side, a tattoo of a pistol shooting flowers, which is about as perfect a symbol of Kortne as anyone could design. Something that looks hard on the surface, blooming into something soft and alive. She loved reggae music and the loose, open, peace-minded way of living that came with it. There is a detail from later in this story, small and almost unbearably sweet, that a local pizza shop would sell what they called peace pizzas in her honor, inspired by her love of reggae and the hippie lifestyle and peace, with the money going toward finding her. That was the impression she left on the town. That is the shape of the hole she left behind. To understand what her disappearance did to the people around her, you have to understand how present she was in their lives. This was not a young woman who had drifted to the edges of her family, the way some people do in their early 20s. Kortne was in the middle of hers. Her parents had separated years earlier, but the family had not scattered, and Kortne moved easily between its parts, close to her mother, close to her father, close to her younger sister and her brothers. She was the kind of daughter who was expected at the fair on a Sunday, the kind of sister whose absence would be noticed within hours rather than days. And that closeness, in the end, is the reason anyone went looking for her at all. Picture her at work on an ordinary weekday that summer. You're in a small salon, the smell of shampoo and hairspray in the air, a radio playing low in the corner. Kortne is there, talking a mile a minute, making a client laugh, her hands sure and gentle. Later that same day, she might be at the grooming table, easing a nervous dog through a bath, murmuring to it the way only someone who genuinely loves animals can. She worked more than one of these jobs at a time, piecing together a living out of the things she cared about, beauty and animals, the 2 directions her mother said she was still choosing between. It was not a life of big money or settled plans. It was a life of small kindnesses, extended over and over, to people and to animals who could not always say thank you back. Let's talk about where she was living, because the geography of this case matters more than almost anything else. In 2012, Kortne was living in an apartment at 810 West Main Street in Palmyra. Palmyra is a small borough in Lebanon County, the kind of place with a walkable main street and old brick buildings and neighbors who can hear each other through the walls. Her apartment was 1 unit in a shared building. She lived there with her boyfriend at the time, a young man named Bradley Herr, who went by Brad. Brad was 20 years old, a year younger than Kortne, and as we will come to, He was under a set of legal restrictions in that summer that would end up playing a quiet but pivotal role in the events of her last night. And she had her dog. This is a detail worth sitting with. Because of everything Kortne left behind that night, the dog is the one that the people who knew her point to first. Kortne was an animal person to her core. She groomed animals for a living. She had grown up surrounded by them. The idea that she would walk out of her life and leave her dog behind, alone in that apartment, is, to her family and to almost everyone who has looked closely at this case, simply not believable. It is one of the small, stubborn facts that refuses to fit any comfortable explanation. She would not have left the dog. Now picture the building itself, a shared structure on a main street, close quarters, thin floors, a stairwell that everyone used, apartments stacked so near to one another that a raised voice in one unit could be heard in the next. Below and around Kortne lived her neighbors, ordinary people living ordinary lives, and there had been friction there for a while before that summer night. According to Kortne's friends, she had been having problems with some of those neighbors for some time. She felt, in the words of people close to her, that they were busybodies, always watching, always noting, always ready to complain. It was the kind of low-grade neighborly tension that plays out in 1,000 apartment buildings and almost never leads anywhere. Almost never. To be fair to everyone involved, and we are going to try very hard throughout this story to be fair to everyone involved, that tension went both ways. To some of the neighbors, Kortne was loud, young, prone to parties and late nights, and music turned up past the point of politeness. That is a version of a 21-year-old that plenty of people have lived next to, and plenty of people have complained about. And it does not make anyone a villain. But it is the backdrop. It is the low hum underneath the whole night that is coming, and you need to hear it now, quietly, so that later, when it rises, you understand where it came from. Kortne's family, meanwhile, was close and large and present. Her father, Scott, is a man you will hear from a great deal in this story, because in the years since his daughter vanished, he has become the steady, aching center of the effort to find her. Her mother, Wendy, now Wendy Stouffer Hamill, is the one who would drive to that apartment when something felt wrong, and who would be among the first to understand that her daughter was gone. Kortne had siblings, a sister, Kirsten, and brothers, and a wider circle of people who loved her fiercely. She was, by every account, a person embedded in a family, not adrift, not estranged, not someone with a reason to disappear. And this is the thing to hold on to as we move into the night itself. Kortne Stouffer was not a person on the margins of her own life. She was 21, loud, loved, employed, tattooed with peace signs and stars, close to her mother and her father and her sister, the owner of a dog she adored, a young woman with dreams she had not yet had the chance to grow into. She had plans the very next day. She was supposed to meet her family at a local fair, with her brother and her grandfather, an ordinary summer outing on an ordinary summer weekend. She never made it. To understand how that happened, we need to walk through her last known hours slowly and carefully, because they are, in many ways, the entire case. Almost everything that investigators know, almost everything anyone can point to, happened in a single stretch of about 12 hours, from the early evening of Saturday, July 28th, into the pre-dawn dark of Sunday, July 29th. So let's go back to that Saturday evening before any of it had happened, when it was still just a warm night in a small town, and Kortne Stouffer was still exactly where she was supposed to be. The evening of Saturday, July 28th, 2012, began the way a lot of summer weekends begin for people in their early 20s. There was a small party at the apartment on West Main Street, the one Kortne shared with Brad. Friends came over, there was drinking and there was music, the ordinary noise of young people with a night off and nowhere in particular to be. Kortne, by every account, had the night off from work, and she intended to enjoy it. There was nothing sinister in any of it. Nothing that anyone in that apartment could have known was the beginning of anything. It was just a Saturday. But here is the first detail that matters, and it matters more than it should. Brad Herr, Kortne's boyfriend, was 20 years old that summer. He was under the age of 21, and he was on house arrest, under the supervision of adult probation, connected to an earlier charge of driving under the influence while underage, which is to say, Brad was not supposed to be drinking, and Brad was not supposed to be hosting or attending a party, and Brad, that night, was doing both. In a shared building, with neighbors who had grown tired of the noise and the comings and goings, that was a fragile situation. It only needed one phone call to come apart. That phone call came. Somewhere in the building that evening, one of the neighbors, a man named Todd Saksek, saw people carrying cases of beer into the residence. Knowing that Brad was under 21 and under probation, Saksek alerted adult probation. And so, at around 9 o'clock that night, Palmyra Borough Police, together with officers from Lebanon County Adult Probation, arrived at 810 West Main Street, responding to a report of an underage drinking party. Picture the scene, because it is the last time in this story that everything is still, in a sense, recoverable. A warm summer night, a knock at the door, uniformed officers stepping into a small apartment full of young people, red cups and open cans, the sudden sick lurch in everyone's stomach when the party stops. Inside, police found 7 people. Of those 7, Kortne, at 21, was the only one legally old enough to drink. 2 of the others were cited for underage drinking and released. And Brad, because of his probation, because of the house arrest, because of the DUI hanging over him, was taken into custody. He was arrested for a probation violation and removed from the apartment. There's something worth pausing on in that image of Brad being taken away because of how completely ordinary the trigger was. This was not a raid or a violent confrontation or the culmination of some long criminal saga. It was a noise complaint and an underage drinking call, the kind of thing that happens in small towns every weekend of the year and is forgotten by Monday. A few young people, some beer, a party that ran a little loud. In almost every version of that night, everyone sleeps it off and wakes up fine. The cruelty of Kortne's story is how small the first domino was and how far it would end up falling. For Kortne, though, the arrest was not small at all. Brad was not just a party guest being cited. He was her boyfriend, the person she shared that apartment with. And he was now in custody, facing a probation violation that could send him to prison. She had every reason to be frightened for him and furious at whoever she believed had set it in motion. And she had already settled on an answer. It was the neighbors. It had to be the neighbors, the ones who had been watching, the ones who had complained before, the ones whose windows looked out on everything she did. Right or wrong, that conviction is the emotional engine of everything that followed. Every choice Kortne made in the hours ahead was made by a young woman who believed with the certainty that alcohol and fear can lend, that the people next door had just helped take someone she loved. Sit with what that means for Kortne, standing in her own living room, watching her boyfriend be led away by police over a party in their own home. She was furious, not at herself, and not really at the police, but at the neighbors, because she was certain, in that immediate, alcohol-sharpened way, that it was one of them who had made the call. She believed her neighbors had watched and noted and picked up the phone and gotten Brad taken away, and in her mind, that was a betrayal that could not stand. When the police and probation officers finally left, they left one person behind in that apartment. They left Kortne. She was the only one remaining, alone now, angry and worried, because Brad's arrest was not a small thing. It carried the real possibility of a prison sentence, and she knew it. You're standing in that apartment with her, in the quiet after everyone has gone. The cups are still out. The music is off. Your boyfriend is in the back of a patrol car on his way to be booked, and the silence in the room is the silence of a good night that has curdled into something else. This is the moment the night could have ended. If Kortne had simply gone to bed, angry and alone, we would not be telling this story. But she did not go to bed. At around 7 minutes past 10 that night, Kortne's phone lit up. Two of her friends, a young man named Cody Pruitt and another named Milton Rodriguez Jr., were texting her, asking her to come out and join them and some others at a bar in the nearby town of Hummelstown, a place called the Gas Station Kitchen and Bar. It was, on its face, exactly the kind of invitation a good friend extends to someone having a bad night. Come out. Get out of that apartment. Do not sit there alone stewing over Brad. And Kortne, who was, by every description, someone who did not like to be alone and did not like to sit still, said yes. She drove herself to the gas station bar in Hummelstown, and this is worth noting carefully because the location of Kortne's car becomes one of the strange, telling threads of this whole night. She drove her own vehicle to that bar. Once she met up with the group there, though, the plan grew. Kortne, Cody, Milton, and another couple decided to head into Harrisburg to the 2nd Street area, a stretch of the city lined with restaurants and bars, a place where a younger crowd goes to spend a Saturday night. And rather than everyone driving separately, they piled into a single car, a 2004 Acura that belonged to Milton Rodriguez. Kortne left her own car parked at the gas station bar in Hummelstown and rode into the city with her friends. Now picture 2nd Street in Harrisburg late on a Saturday night in July. Warm air, crowded sidewalks, the sound of music spilling out of open doorways, the particular energy of a city block built for people who are out to have a good time. The group made their way through it. By some accounts, they stopped first at a bar known for beer pong and a dance floor, a loud, young, boisterous place, and then moved down the block to another popular spot, a bar in the mold of the ones you have seen in movies, all noise and bartenders and crowds pressed together. And it was there, at around 10 minutes to 2 in the morning, now technically Sunday, July 29th, that the night took its first hard turn. Kortne got into a verbal altercation. The exact nature of it is not perfectly clear, and this is one of the places where the accounts diverge. So let's be honest about that. According to the official timeline, the argument was with a girlfriend of a man named Arvard Brown. According to some other reporting, Kortne actually confronted a person she believed had stolen money from her at some point in the past, and that is what set it off. What is consistent across the accounts is that it was a screaming argument, loud enough and heated enough that security intervened, and Kortne was asked to leave the bar. For a brief stretch, she was separated from her group, alone, on a city street at 2 in the morning, having been thrown out of a bar. It is the kind of moment that can go very wrong for a young woman on her own, and it is a measure of how close this story came to a different ending, and how quickly that it did not go wrong there. Her friends found her again, the group reunited, and in a detail that is almost painfully normal, they did what people do at 2 in the morning after a long night out. They stopped for pizza, they got some food, and they went back to the car, and they pointed themselves toward home. Have you ever wondered how many ordinary decisions stack up on a night like this? The decision to go out at all, the decision to leave her own car behind in Hummelstown, the decision to ride into the city with the group, the decision that ended with her being escorted out of a bar and briefly alone on a strange street. Any one of them, made differently, changes everything, and yet none of them, on their own, was the wrong decision. They were just the small, human choices of a young woman having a night, the same choices millions of people make every weekend and wake up from, unharmed, with nothing but a hangover and a story. It is worth slowing down to picture the geography of that return trip, because it tells you how much movement was packed into those pre-dawn hours. Harrisburg sits along the Susquehanna River, and the drive back toward the small towns of Lebanon County runs some 17 miles east, a journey of roughly 25 minutes on quiet, late-night roads, 2-lane highways, dark farmland on either side, the occasional gas station glowing at an empty intersection. This is the kind of country where at 3 in the morning you can drive for long stretches and pass no one at all. And Kortne's path through it was not a straight line home. She had left her own car behind in Hummelstown when the group first set out for the city, so the route back was a loop within a loop. The group drove from Harrisburg toward Palmyra, dropping Milton at his home along the way. Then Cody drove Kortne back out to Hummelstown to collect her car. Then the two of them drove separately from Hummelstown back to Palmyra, threading the same dark roads a second time. By the time Kortne finally pulled up outside 810 West Main Street, she had crossed that stretch of Lebanon County more than once in the space of a few hours, and the night was very nearly over. In an hour or so, in most versions of this story, she would have been asleep. Instead, she stepped out of her car and straight back into the fight she had left behind. At around 2 o'clock in the morning, the group made their first stop on the way home. They dropped Milton Rodriguez off at his house, which sat only a few blocks from Kortne's own apartment in the Palmyra area. This detail comes, in part, from Rodriguez's own father, who later told investigators and reporters about the timing of that night. With Milton dropped off, the group was smaller now. Cody Pruitt was behind the wheel, driving Milton's car, acting as the designated driver for the night, and Kortne still needed to get her own vehicle, which was sitting, all this time, back at the gas station bar in Hummelstown. So the route home was not direct. At around 2:45 in the morning, the group made the roughly 17-mile drive back toward the Palmyra area, a trip of about 25 minutes from Harrisburg, and then Kortne asked Cody to take her back to Hummelstown, to the gas station bar, so she could retrieve her car. He did. Cody drove Kortne to her vehicle, and then According to the timeline, he followed her back to her residence in Palmyra, the two of them now in separate cars, threading through the empty pre-dawn streets of Lebanon County toward the apartment on West Main Street where all of this had started, hours earlier, with a party and an arrest. They arrived home at around 3 o'clock in the morning, and whatever calm the night out might have given Kortne, it did not survive contact with that building. Because the moment she was back at 810 West Main Street, she was face to face again with the neighbors she blamed for Brad's arrest, and her anger, which had been simmering for hours, came roaring back. What happened next unfolded over the course of about an hour, and it involved the same small cast of people going back and forth, calling and recalling the police in a slow, awful escalation that no one, at the time, understood was building toward anything permanent. Let's walk through it carefully because these are, quite literally, the last documented moments of Kortne Stouffer's life that we have. When Kortne got back to the building, she got into a verbal altercation with 3 of her neighbors. Their names were Janice Riemenschneider, Richard Sheets, who went by Rick, and Todd Saksek, the same man who had alerted probation about the beer earlier that night. Kortne suspected, correctly or not, that these were the people who had set the whole disaster in motion, and she confronted them. Voices were raised. The argument spilled out into the shared spaces of the building and the night air around it. You're standing on that quiet main street at 3 in the morning. The town is asleep. The storefronts are dark, the windows above them mostly black, and into that silence comes the sound of a young woman's voice, raised and raw, and the answering voices of her neighbors, and the particular ugly music of an argument that has been building all night, finally breaking open. Somewhere in the building, a dog is barking, lights are coming on behind curtains, and a man named Rick Sheets is picking up a phone to call the police because the young woman upstairs is, in his telling, out of control. What makes this stretch of the night so hard to look at in hindsight is that it reads, at the time, as nothing more than a neighbor dispute. Loud, unpleasant, the sort of thing that fills a police log and empties out of memory by the next afternoon. Nobody standing on that street, not the neighbors, not the responding officers, not Cody, and not Kortne herself, could have known that these were the last hours anyone would be able to account for. That is the quiet horror underneath so many of these cases. The moment that turns out to matter most almost never looks, while it is happening, like it matters at all. It was Rick Sheets who called the police. He phoned Palmyra police to report that Kortne was starting trouble and making threats toward him. And while he was still on the line with the dispatcher, describing what was happening, he added a detail that would echo through the rest of this case. He said that Kortne had gone into her apartment and that there was a man with her, and that the man was also causing problems. That man, we know from the timeline, was Cody Pruitt, who had followed her home. At around 3:15 in the morning, Palmyra police arrived at the residence for the second time that night. And now there were competing stories, the way there always are when everyone involved has been drinking and everyone is angry. Kortne told the officers that the neighbors had come out and started yelling at her while she was simply walking her dog. The neighbors told the officers that Kortne was the one being loud and unruly. Todd Saksek told police that Kortne had been yelling at him, and more seriously, that she had kicked him in the leg. Witnesses would later describe Todd and Kortne standing chest to chest, screaming into each other's faces in the dark. Everyone involved, the officers noted, appeared to be under the influence of alcohol. The police did what police do in a situation like that, when it is late and everyone is drunk and no one is bleeding. They separated the parties. They told everyone to go back inside their own homes, to sleep it off, to leave each other alone. A backup unit from the North Londonderry Police Department arrived as well, a second jurisdiction now aware of the address, of the tension of the young woman at the center of it. The officers stayed until around 4 o'clock in the morning, and when they were satisfied that things had settled, they left. Everyone had gone back inside, and the building was quiet, and Kortne was in her apartment with Cody there as well. And as far as the officers knew, the night was over. It was not over, because not 30 minutes after the police left, Todd Saksek called them again. This time he reached out through the County Emergency Management Agency, and he reported that Kortne was at it again. She was stomping on the floor of her apartment, he said, slamming doors, making threats to him and to the other neighbors, deliberately, he believed, to aggravate them. And so, for a third time that night, Palmyra police headed back to 810 West Main Street, this time with backup from 2 nearby jurisdictions, the address now well known to law enforcement across the small towns of that corner of Lebanon County. Now here is the part of the night that has haunted this case ever since, the part that people who study it come back to again and again, turning it over, unable to make it lie flat. When the officers arrived for that third and final visit, Todd Saksek met them outside. He repeated his complaint that Kortne was stomping and slamming doors, that he believed she was doing it on purpose. The officers went to Kortne's door, and they knocked. There was no response, so they knocked again. And again, nothing came back to them from inside. They were able to see into the residence through a patio door and a nearby window, and what they saw, they said, was nothing out of place, nothing unusual, an ordinary apartment, quiet now, the lights low or off. When they knocked, the dogs inside barked from somewhere deep in the residence, and then quieted, and then barked again when the officers knocked a second time. But of Kortne herself, there was no sign, and no sound, and no answer. And here the officers faced a decision that would be second-guessed for more than a decade. There had been a noise complaint. The noise had stopped. The apartment looked normal through the window. No one was answering the door, and in the judgment of the officers on scene, there were no legal grounds to force their way inside over a settled disturbance in the middle of the night. So, they did not go in. They knocked, and they looked, and they listened, and then, finding nothing to act on, the Palmyra police left. Some accounts say they also knocked on Todd Saksek's door before leaving the building, and that he, too, did not answer. That was the last time. That knock on the door, unanswered, at some point after 4 o'clock in the morning on July 29th, 2012, is the final moment in the entire timeline where anyone in an official capacity was that close to Kortne Stouffer. The police were quite literally standing at her door, and no one knows to this day whether she was on the other side of it. Here is what we have after that, and it comes almost entirely from one person. Cody Pruitt, who had followed Kortne home and was inside the apartment with her, later told Kortne's family and investigators his account of the rest of the night. He said that Kortne had started harassing the neighbors again after the police left, and that he had managed to get her to calm down. He said that the two of them then went to sleep in separate rooms at around 4 o'clock in the morning. And he said that he woke up later that morning at around 7 o'clock, though some accounts put it closer to 7:30 or 8, and noticed that Kortne was not there. Believing she had simply gone out or gone off somewhere, he left the apartment. After he left, Cody's morning included a few details that would later draw scrutiny, and we're going to come back to all of them, carefully and fairly, when we talk about the theories, because they deserve careful handling and not a rush to judgment. But for the timeline itself, here is what is documented. After leaving the apartment, Cody stopped at a convenience store to make a purchase, and he was captured there on the store's security cameras. He texted Kortne around that time and got no reply. He also, by some accounts, tried to call her from a payphone, which is a detail people find strange, given that he had a working cell phone he had already been texting her from. And later that day, he texted her again, once at around 12:36 in the afternoon, and again at just before 2 in the afternoon, and received no response either time. Meanwhile, the rest of the world had no idea anything was wrong. It was Sunday. Kortne had plans that day. She was supposed to meet her family at a local fair, with her brother and her grandfather, an ordinary summer outing. When she did not show up and did not answer her phone, the small worry began. And in a detail that says everything about how the tensions of that night carried into the morning, at around 7:30 that morning, one of the neighbors who had been fighting with Kortne through the night went to the authorities to make a formal complaint against her over the disturbance, a complaint against a young woman who, though no one yet knew it, was already gone. By the following day, Monday, July 30th, the worry had sharpened into fear. Kortne's mother, Wendy, drove down to the apartment to check on her daughter, and what she found is the image that sits at the center of this entire case, the still life of an interrupted life. The door was unlocked. Kortne's dog was still inside, alone. Her car was parked outside, in the driveway, with the windows rolled down. Inside, everything was in its place. Her purse sat next to her bed, and inside, it were her cigarettes, her money, and her cell phone. Her shoes and her keys were on the stair landing, exactly where she always left them, where she customarily set them down when she came home. Nothing looked disturbed. Nothing looked broken. There were no signs of a struggle, no signs of a break-in, no signs of a crime at all. There was simply no Kortne. Scott Stouffer, Kortne's father, reported his daughter missing to the Palmyra Police Department, and with that phone call, the night of July 29th, stopped being a series of drunken disturbances and became something far larger and far darker. A young woman had vanished from inside her own home, leaving behind every single thing a person needs to live a life: her money and her phone, her keys and her car, and the dog she adored. She had, it seemed, walked out of her own existence and into thin air, from a building that had been surrounded by awake, watching neighbors and visited 3 times that night by the police. The question that has never been answered, the question that sits under everything that follows, is the one you are probably already asking. If she did not leave on her own, and everything about that scene says she did not, then how did she leave at all? And who was the last person to be with her? Which brings us to the investigation and to the choices, early on, that many people believe cost Kortne her best chance of being found. Let's talk about the first hours after Kortne was reported missing, because if you want to understand why this case has never been solved, You have to understand how it began. And how it began, according to Kortne's own family, was slowly. Too slowly. Scott Stouffer has been painfully direct about those early hours. The first 20 to 30 hours, he later told Dateline, it was pretty much just our family looking for Kortne. Think about that. In the window of time that matters most in any missing persons case, the window when a trail is still warm, when memories are still sharp, when a person might still be alive and reachable. The primary search effort was not a coordinated law enforcement operation. It was a father and a family making phone calls, driving around, knocking on doors. We started calling people who she was with that last night. Scott said, we couldn't find her. There was no contact at all after early Sunday morning. To be fair to the officers involved, the very nature of Kortne's last night worked against an urgent response, and it is worth naming that honestly. Here was a 21-year-old who had been out drinking, who had been involved in multiple loud disturbances, who had been at the center of 3 separate police visits in a single night. From the outside, in the first hours, it was easy for someone to assume she had simply gone off somewhere to cool down, to sleep it off at a friend's place, to put some distance between herself and a very bad night. People in their early 20s do disappear for a day and come back. That assumption is not evil, but it is exactly the assumption that a person who has come to real harm cannot afford anyone to make. And this is where the criticism of the investigation begins. And it is criticism that Kortne's family and many independent observers have voiced for years. There is a widely held belief among the people closest to this case that a bias toward Kortne's character, the partying, the drinking, the loudness, the arrest of that night, led investigators to take her disappearance less seriously than they should have, at least at the start. The search, by many accounts, was delayed for more than 72 hours after she was reported missing. More than 3 full days. In a missing persons case, 72 hours is not a delay. It is a catastrophe. It is the difference between a scene that can still speak and a scene that has gone cold and silent. Have you ever wondered how much of what we call an unsolved case is really an unstarted one? How many mysteries are not mysteries at all, but simply the long shadow of a beginning that came too late? We cannot know what a faster, harder, more urgent first response might have found in the hours right after Kortne vanished. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. That not knowing is its own kind of wound, and it is one the Stouffer family has carried every single day since. It is worth stepping back for a moment to talk about why those first hours matter so much, in any case like this, not just in Kortne's. The people who do this work have a grim understanding of how fast a trail goes cold, sometimes within a single day. Witnesses forget or convince themselves of things that did not happen, or quietly align their stories with one another. Physical evidence degrades. Weather moves through and erases what was left outside. A person who has been taken can be moved a very long way in 72 hours, and a person who is still alive and in danger during those hours may not be by the time a serious search finally begins. None of this is a secret to law enforcement. It is precisely why the standard in a genuine missing persons case is to move fast and treat it seriously from the first hour, and to apologize later if it turns out the person simply went somewhere to cool off. That is the standard Kortne's family believes was not met, at least at the start. And the reason they point to is an uncomfortable one, but it is worth stating plainly. because it is a pattern that appears in case after case across the country. When the missing person is someone whose last night involved drinking and partying and arrests and public arguments, there can be a temptation, conscious or not, to file them mentally under a different heading, to assume they brought the chaos on themselves, that they will turn up, that this is a lifestyle problem rather than an emergency. It is a quiet form of judgment, and it can be devastating, because the young woman who is loud and difficult and having a terrible night is exactly as capable of being harmed as anyone else, and exactly as deserving of a fast and serious search. Whether that judgment shaped the early response in Kortne's case is something reasonable people can debate, and investigators would surely tell it differently than the family does. But the raw fact remains that, by the account of the person closest to her, the first day and more of searching was carried by the family alone. The officer who was eventually assigned to the case, a sergeant named DiPaolo, said he was brought onto it about 2 days after Kortne was last seen. Once he was assigned, he did the work that needed doing. Authorities immediately began conducting interviews with the people who had last seen Kortne, walking back through the night, trying to build the timeline that we have just walked through together. But as he would later admit, nothing brought them closer to finding her. Every thread they pulled ran out. Every interview ended in the same place. A young woman who was there and awake and shouting through the walls at 4 o'clock in the morning, and then simply was not anywhere at all. Let's talk about what was actually searched, because a great deal was, even if it came later than it should have. On the 8th of August 2012, roughly a week and a half after Kortne vanished, police conducted a formal ground search. They brought in K9 units and covered a 2-mile radius around the residence, dogs working the fields and the edges of the woods and the quiet spaces of a small Pennsylvania town in high summer. Kortne's own family, along with as many as 50 volunteers, searched nearby fields and the woods near her apartment on their own, walking shoulder to shoulder through the tall grass, looking for anything, dreading finding anything. Nothing substantial turned up. The apartment itself was secured and searched by forensic teams. And here the physical evidence tells a strange, frustrating story, because there was almost none of it. There were no signs of a struggle inside the residence, no signs of a break-in, no indication of a crime scene that someone had cleaned up or covered over. Investigators looked carefully for the physical traces that violence leaves behind, and they did not find them. Kortne's vehicle was given a forensic search as well, and in the weeks that followed, the search widened to the people who had been part of her orbit that night. This is the part of the investigation we have to walk through with the most care, because it involves living people, none of whom has ever been charged with anything, and every one of whom is entitled to the presumption of innocence. Search warrants were executed. Investigators searched the 2004 Acura that Milton Rodriguez had been driving that night. They searched Rodriguez's home, and by some accounts, his father allowed them to search his property as well. They searched, or attempted to search, the residences of the neighbors, Kortne's neighbors, whose houses were subjected to forensic examination. They looked at the people who had been closest to her in her final hours, and across all of it, according to the reporting, they found nothing substantial, nothing that linked any specific person to Kortne's disappearance, nothing that could support an arrest. 2 people in particular were the subject of intense attention: simply because of where they sat in the timeline. Cody Pruitt and Milton Rodriguez had been the last of Kortne's friends to be with her that night. Cody, especially, occupied the most difficult position anyone can occupy in a case like this. He was, by the documented timeline, the last known person to see Kortne. He had followed her home. He said he had slept in a separate room and woken to find her gone. And so, naturally, investigators questioned him closely. According to reporting at the time, Cody took a polygraph test and he offered his DNA to investigators. Milton Rodriguez, for his part, was spoken to by police for what his father described as 5 days in a row, and his father maintained that his son had an alibi and was not capable of hurting anyone. And here is the crucial fact, the one that has to be stated plainly and cannot be glossed over. The District Attorney's Office of Lebanon County stated, on the record, that neither Cody Pruitt nor Milton Rodriguez was a suspect or a person of interest in Kortne's disappearance. That is not a small qualification. That is the office responsible for prosecuting crimes in that county, saying clearly that these two men were not considered suspects. Investigators looked at them hard and cleared them. To this day, in fact, police have never publicly named any suspect and never publicly named any person of interest in the disappearance of Kortne Stouffer. Not the friends who were with her, not the neighbors she fought with, no one. Which is, in its own way, one of the most unsettling facts of the entire case. Because a young woman does not vanish from a lockdown building surrounded by witnesses by pure accident. Something happened. Someone, somewhere, knows something. And yet, after more than a decade of investigation, the official position remains that there is no one to point to. To be fair to the investigators who have worked this case, and many of them have worked it seriously and for a long time, the absence of named suspects is not always a sign of failure. Sometimes it is a sign of restraint. It is genuinely possible to ruin an innocent person's life by naming them publicly, and it is genuinely possible to poison a future prosecution by saying too much too soon. Detectives who decline to name names are not always hiding a lack of effort. Sometimes they are protecting a case they still hope to bring. We do not know, from the outside, which of those things is true here. We only know the result, and the result is that there are no names, no charges, and no answers. Over the years, the effort did not stop, even if it slowed. In 2015, roughly 3 years into the case, Kortne's family, working through their attorney, connected with a private investigator named Leah Jennings. The reasoning behind that decision is quietly revealing. The family was looking for someone who could conduct interviews, who was not a police officer, Jennings explained. Sometimes people will talk to a private investigator when they will not talk to the police precisely because a private investigator has no power to arrest them. It is easier, sometimes, to say a dangerous thing to someone who cannot put you in handcuffs. That is what the family was hoping for. Someone a reluctant witness might finally open up to. Jennings took the case seriously and stayed with it. There's always a possibility that foul play is involved, she said. And there's also a possibility that Kortne will come walking in tomorrow. The intensity and the focus does not change, she said. The focus is to find Kortne. Any tip is followed up on, no matter how small or insignificant. Kortne has not been forgotten, and we will keep working until she is found. Period. There is no other option. That is the voice of someone who has looked into this case for years and refused to let it go cold in her own mind, whatever the paperwork says. The case drew national attention too in the way that certain disappearances do. In the spring of 2017, the Investigation Discovery series that profiles people who vanish without a trace aired an episode devoted to Kortne, titled around the idea of someone being spirited away. It brought her face and her story to a national audience, generated fresh tips, and kept the case alive in the public imagination. And on the 10th anniversary of her disappearance, in the summer of 2022, the chief county detective for Lebanon County, a man named Jonathan Hess, issued a detailed press release summarizing everything the investigation had established over that decade. It was the source of much of the careful, hour-by-hour timeline we walked through earlier. It was also, in a sense, an admission. 10 years of work, and the most that could be offered to the public was a clean account of the night she disappeared, and a plea for anyone who knew anything to finally come forward. Because that, in the end, is what the investigation has come down to. Not a lack of effort in the later years, but a lack of the one thing every cold case needs and almost never gets on its own: a person willing to break their silence. The physical evidence is exhausted. The apartment gave up nothing, the searches turned up nothing, and the forensics linked no one. The polygraphs were passed, the alibis held, and the warrants came back empty. What remains, the only thing that remains, is knowledge, held in the mind of at least one living person, about what happened in the dark hours of July 29th, 2012. Have you ever wondered what it would take for someone to carry a secret like that for more than a decade? To watch a father age on the local news every summer, begging for information, to float past a creek full of people wearing a missing woman's face on their shirts, to know and to say nothing, year after year after year. Whoever that person is, if they exist, and the shape of this case strongly suggests they do, they have had a very long time to make peace with their silence. The investigation, then, gives us a strange and painful inheritance. It gives us a near-complete picture of Kortne's last night, and almost nothing about her last moments. It gives us a list of people who are close by, and a firm official statement that none of them is a suspect. It gives us search cars and search homes and search fields, and not one physical trace of where she went. It is, in a sense, a perfectly documented disappearance. We can tell you almost everything about the hours before Kortne Stouffer vanished. We cannot tell you the one thing that matters, and into that silence, inevitably, the theories have rushed. So let's talk about them, carefully and fairly, and with the same commitment to the difference between what is known and what is merely imagined. Before we go any further, we need to set a ground rule, and we need to hold to it for this entire section. Every person we are about to discuss is a living human being who has never been charged with any crime in connection with Kortne's disappearance. Some of them were investigated and explicitly cleared. None of them has been named by police as a suspect or a person of interest. What follows is a discussion of theories, of the ideas that have circulated among investigators, family members, journalists, and the wider public over more than a decade. A theory is not an accusation. Speculation is not evidence, and the fact that a question has been raised about someone does not make them guilty of anything. We are going to keep that distinction sharp because the people in this story deserve it, and because Kortne deserves a telling that stays honest. With that said, Let's talk about the theories, more or less in the order that the evidence tends to push people toward them. The first and most obvious question anyone asks is about the people who were with Kortne that night. This is not because there is any proof against them. It is simply because of the shape of the timeline. Kortne was last known to be alive in an apartment where, by his own account, one other person was present. The disappearance happened not out in the world, not on a dark road or in a strange place, but inside her own home, in the narrow window between the police leaving for the last time and the morning. And so, inevitably, attention has returned, again and again, to Cody Pruitt, the friend who followed her home, and who said he slept in a separate room and woke to find her gone. Let's be scrupulously fair here, because this is exactly the kind of situation where an innocent person can be crushed by suspicion. Cody Pruitt cooperated with the investigation in significant ways. He took a polygraph test, he offered his DNA, he gave his account of the night, and he later spoke at length with Kortne's own father, Scott, in a conversation that Scott has said lasted about 45 minutes, and, most importantly, the Lebanon County District Attorney's Office stated clearly that Cody was not a suspect and not a person of interest. Investigators looked at the person best positioned to know something, and they did not find grounds to move against him. That has to count for a great deal, and it does. At the same time, honesty requires acknowledging that some observers, including some people close to the case, have never fully made their peace with how the night reads. There are details that people find difficult to set aside. The claim that Cody slept through a period when the neighbors were reporting stomping and slamming and shouting in a small apartment and heard nothing. The account of him trying to reach Kortne from a payphone the next morning, when he had a working cell phone he had already been texting her from. The fact that, by some accounts of friends, he had held feelings for Kortne for a long time. None of those details is proof of anything. Each of them has an innocent explanation, and innocent people behave in odd ways all the time, especially the morning after a chaotic night, especially when they later realize they may have been the last person to see someone alive. But they are the reason the question has never entirely gone away. Even Scott Stouffer, Kortne's father, has spoken about this with a kind of raw, careful ambivalence that is hard to listen to. Asked in an interview whether he believed what Cody had told him, Scott paused for a long moment before answering. "I'd like to believe him," he said, "but it's difficult." He described asking Cody a question that only a grieving father could ask. What if I were the last person with one of your family members, and that was the last time you ever saw them? What would you think of me? That is not an accusation. It is the sound of a man trying and struggling to extend trust across an unbearable uncertainty. And it is worth remembering that Scott's difficulty in believing is the difficulty of a father in pain, not a finding of fact. Cody Pruitt has never been charged and has never been named a suspect, and that is where the record stands. The second theory turns in a different direction, toward the neighbors. This is the theory that has, over the years, generated the most heat online, and it needs the most caution because it involves ordinary people whose only documented role in this story is that they lived near a young woman and called the police about noise, which is not a crime. The tension between Kortne and her neighbors, Todd Saksek, Rick Sheets, and Janice Riemenschneider, was real, and it was documented. There was the underage drinking complaint, that led to Brad's arrest. There was the screaming confrontation when Kortne got home. There was the moment, witnessed by others, of Kortne and Todd standing chest to chest. There was Kortne kicking Todd in the leg and Todd calling the police twice in the small hours of the morning. Some who suspect the neighbors point to the strangeness of the surveillance as they see it. Here were people who were awake, angry, and watching Kortne's apartment closely enough to call the police repeatedly about her. And yet, they argue, somehow no one saw anything when she actually disappeared. How, this theory asks, could people that focused on that apartment have missed a young woman being taken from it? It is a fair question to raise, but it is important to be honest about what the theory is and is not. It is a suspicion built on proximity and animosity. It is not evidence. Investigators searched the neighbors' homes and conducted forensic examinations, and, according to the reporting, found nothing linking any of them to Kortne's disappearance. There is a real and important difference between people who disliked a neighbor and people who harmed one, and nothing in the public record has ever bridged that gap. The neighbors have never been charged. They have never been named as suspects. They are, in the eyes of the law and in the eyes of this telling, innocent people who happen to live next to a tragedy. There is a related idea, which is that the noise the neighbors reported after the police left for the second time, the stomping, the slamming of doors, may not have been what it seemed. Some have wondered aloud whether that final burst of noise could have been Kortne in distress rather than Kortne in a rage, a struggle rather than a tantrum, an attempt to make noise and be heard. It is a genuinely haunting possibility, and it deserves to be named. But it runs hard into the physical evidence, and the physical evidence is stubborn. When forensic teams examined the apartment, they found no signs of a struggle. Nothing broken, nothing overturned, nothing to suggest a violent fight had taken place in those rooms. And Kortne had her dog, an animal that by every account of who Kortne was, would have reacted to a threat to her. The absence of any sign of violence inside that apartment is one of the hardest facts in the whole case, because it cuts against almost every dark theory people want to reach for. This is worth sitting with, because it is the central paradox of the entire case, the thing that makes it so resistant to every explanation. On one side, you have a disappearance that feels, in every human way, like a crime. A young woman does not walk away from her dog, her phone, her money, her car, and her family in the middle of the night for no reason and forever. On the other side, you have a scene that offers not a single physical trace of a crime, no forced entry, no struggle, no damage, and nothing to suggest that anything violent happened in those rooms at all. Both of those things appear to be true at once, and they are very hard to hold together. There are only a few ways to square that circle, and none of them is comfortable. One possibility is that whatever happened to Kortne happened somewhere other than inside that apartment, that she left or was led out of it under her own power, willingly or by persuasion or by threat, and that the harm came afterward, out of sight. That would explain the untouched apartment, but it runs into the problem that no one reported seeing her leave in a building full of people who were awake and watching. Another possibility is that something did happen inside, but was carried out and covered up with a care and a calm that left no trace, which is far harder to do than television suggests, and which the forensic examination was specifically looking for and did not find. And a third possibility, the one the family cannot bear and the evidence does not support, is that she chose to vanish on her own, which every fact about the scene and about who she was argues against. The honest answer is that we do not know which of these is closest to the truth, and the evidence, as it stands, does not force us toward any of them, which leads to a third theory, the idea of an intruder. Some have speculated that Brad's absence that night, his sudden arrest, left the apartment vulnerable in a way that someone, somewhere, knew how to exploit. That someone came to that apartment in the pre-dawn hours looking for money, or for drugs, or for both, and that something went terribly wrong. It is a theory that at least tries to account for the absence of an obvious motive among the known cast, but it too struggles against the scene itself. There was no forced entry. There was no ransacking, no sign that someone had torn through the apartment looking for valuables. Kortne's purse, with her money still in it, sat untouched by her bed. If someone came for money, they left the most obvious money behind. The intruder theory can be neither proven nor entirely dismissed, which is, unfortunately, true of almost every idea in this case. The fourth theory is the gentlest one, and it is the one Kortne's family has fought hardest against, because if it were true, it would mean she is out there somewhere, alive, having chosen to go. In the years after she vanished, rumors circulated that Kortne had simply left, that she had gone to Florida, that she had walked away from her life to start another one. There is a version of the free spirit that lends itself to this story, the idea that a young woman drawn to peace and open roads might one day just point herself down one and not look back. But this theory dissolves the moment you hold it against the facts. Kortne left her purse. She left her money and her cigarettes. She left her phone, which no young person voluntarily abandons, and which has never shown a single sign of activity since that morning. She left her car and her keys and her shoes on the landing, and she left her dog alone in the apartment, which the people who knew her insist she would never, ever have done. She had plans the next day to see her family. She was close to her mother, her father, her sister. Her father has said it as plainly as it can be said. I've never thought she walked away from her family. Everything about the scene she left behind argues that she did not choose to leave it. She was, in every practical sense, still living her life, right up until the moment it stopped. Then there are the tips and claims that arrived over the years, some of which sent investigators and searchers back out into the field, and none of which led anywhere. In 2014, a local woman came forward and told authorities that she believed she knew where Kortne's body had been placed. She claimed that Kortne had been killed over money and drugs, wrapped up, driven to a nearby lake, weighed down, and left in the water. It was a specific, terrible claim, and it had to be taken seriously, and it was. A search of the lake was conducted. Nothing of note was found, and over time, that claim came to be widely regarded by people who follow the case as very likely fabricated, possibly an attempt to lay a false trail toward the reward money that had been offered for information. It is a grim reminder that a large reward offered in good faith by a desperate family can draw not only genuine tips, but also the invented ones, the cruel ones, the ones that cost the family a fresh cycle of hope and dread for nothing. And finally, we should mention, briefly and skeptically, the most recent and most speculative theory, because it has circulated widely enough that leaving it out would be a kind of dishonesty. Beginning around 2023, some observers began to wonder aloud whether Kortne's disappearance could be connected to a man who became nationally infamous for an entirely separate case in another state, a man who had lived at one point in the same part of Pennsylvania, not far from where Kortne had lived. Some of Kortne's friends discussed the idea publicly, but we have to be very clear about what this is. It is a geographic coincidence and a timeline that some people find suggestive. It is not evidence. Authorities have not linked that man to Kortne's case in any way, and there is nothing in the public record that ties him to her disappearance beyond the fact that he once lived in the same general region. It is the kind of theory that flourishes online in the absence of answers when a case has gone so cold for so long that people begin reaching toward any nearby darkness that might explain it. It deserves to be named, and it deserves to be set down again just as quickly, because chasing it as if it were fact would dishonor both the truth and the memory of everyone involved. So where does that leave us? It leaves us, honestly, with a set of theories that all share the same fatal weakness. Not one of them is supported by physical evidence. The person best positioned to know something was investigated and cleared, and the neighbors were searched and cleared, and the apartment showed no sign of a struggle. The lake that a tipster pointed to gave up nothing. The reward that was meant to draw the truth drew a false claim instead, and the newest theory is little more than a shape people have drawn in the fog. What we are left with is the hardest thing a case can leave you with, which is a certainty that something happened, paired with a complete inability to say what. Kortne Stouffer did not vanish by accident from a locked apartment surrounded by witnesses. Someone knows, but after all these years, that someone has not spoken, and the evidence that might make them speak has never been found, which is why, in the end, this case is not really about the theories at all. It is about the people who have had to keep living inside the not knowing. So let's talk about them, and about what the years since that summer have looked like for the family Kortne left behind. When a person disappears and is never found, the case does not close, but the world, cruelly, moves on around it. The reporters find new stories. The searches grow further apart. The tip line goes quiet for longer and longer stretches. And in the space that public attention leaves behind, a family is left to do the one thing no family should ever have to do, which is to keep loving someone into an absence year after year, with no ending and no answers and no place to lay their grief down. For the Stouffer family, that has now been more than 13 years. Scott Stouffer, Kortne's father, has become the enduring public face of the search for his daughter, and to hear him talk about it is to understand something about the particular weight of an unsolved disappearance. Every morning, Scott has said, he looks at a photograph of Kortne that he keeps on his kitchen table. It's hard every day, he said, just not being able to hold her, tell her that I love her, and just get to see her, get married, have children, everything that a father looks to. That is the true shape of this kind of loss. It is not only the loss of the person, it is the loss of every future that person was supposed to have, the wedding that will not happen, the grandchildren who will not be born, the ordinary decades that were stolen along with the young woman herself. And Scott's grief is complicated, as the grief of the families of the missing so often is, by the impossibility of knowing what he is even grieving. He does not know if his daughter is alive or dead. He has said, with a kind of stubborn, generous hope that is almost harder to bear than despair would be, that he refuses to give up on the possibility that she is out there. You hear some cases, he said, sometimes 10, 12 years later, and the person walks through the door. I'm all for it. We could pick up any pieces from where she's been, or what she's been through, and in nearly the same breath, he has spoken about the other hope, the darker and more realistic one, that at the very least the family might one day find remains, a clue, some fragment of DNA, something that could finally tie the person responsible to what happened and give them an answer, even a terrible one. To live between those two hopes, the hope that she is alive and the hope that her killer can be found, is to live in a place most of us will never have to imagine. Let's talk about how the family has chosen to carry all of this, because it says everything about who Kortne was to them. Every year, around the anniversary of her disappearance, in the last days of July, her family and her friends, and over time, strangers who never knew her at all, gather at a park in Hershey and float down the Swatara Creek in inner tubes. It was one of Kortne's very favorite things to do in the world. She loved the water, loved the outdoors, loved the slow, sun-warmed drift of a summer day spent on a creek with the people she cared about. And so, rather than gather in a place of mourning, the people who love her gather in the place she loved, and they do the thing she loved, and they let the current carry them the way it once carried her. You're on that creek in late July. The water is cool and green and moving slow. The banks are thick with summer. All around you, in a long, loose flotilla of inner tubes, are dozens of people, some of them wearing shirts with a young woman's face on them, all of them here for the same reason, all of them refusing in the gentlest possible way to let her be forgotten. Kortne's father has said what that day gives him. Every day is like there is no stopping, he said. I can't rest. But when I'm on this float for a little bit, it just gives me a chance to reach out to her spirit a little bit. Her sister Kirsten has said that Kortne is with her every single day, and on the water, in the sunlight, surrounded by the people who loved her, you can almost believe that she is there too, drifting somewhere just ahead, the loudest and the brightest thing on the creek. The turnouts have grown over the years, not shrunk. On the 10th anniversary, dozens gathered. By the 13th, in the summer of 2025, about 100 people came, the biggest turnout the family had ever seen. That is not how these things usually go. Most missing persons cases fade, the crowd thinning a little more with each passing year until the candles grow few. Kortne's has done the opposite, and that is a testament to a family that has simply refused to let the world look away, and to a young woman who left a mark deep enough that even strangers keep showing up to honor it. I'm getting goosebumps, Kirsten said at one of those gatherings. I know that she's with us. I know that she's watching over us. And I know that she just wants us to have the best day, because this is something that she really, really loves to do. The family has kept the practical machinery of the search running too, alongside the remembrance. There is a Facebook page called Kortne Stouffer, Remember Me, where her mother and others have posted for years, sharing updates, coordinating searches, keeping her face in front of the public. In the years after she vanished, family and friends placed missing posters around Palmyra and the neighboring towns. The reward for information, which began in the tens of thousands, was eventually raised to $100,000, an enormous sum for a family to put forward, and a measure of how much they wanted, and still want, just one person to come forward and speak. The local community rallied in its own ways too, including that small, aching detail of the pizza shop selling peace pizzas in her honor, the money going toward the reward, a whole town trying to turn its love for a lost young woman into something that might bring her home. The case has drawn outside attention over the years as well, in waves. The national television profile brought Kortne's face to living rooms across the country and generated a fresh round of tips. Podcasts have taken up her story. Online communities devoted to unsolved cases have combed through the timeline again and again, arguing over the details, keeping the conversation alive in the strange, sprawling way the internet keeps things alive now. Some of that attention has been thoughtful and genuinely useful. Some of it has drifted into speculation that gets well ahead of the facts, which is its own kind of hazard for a family that has to watch strangers debate the worst thing that ever happened to them. But all of it, taken together, has done the one thing the family most needs. It has kept Kortne from disappearing a second time into the silence that swallows so many cold cases after the first few years. Through all of it, the steadiness has come from the people who loved her, a father who has stood in front of cameras every summer for more than a decade, saying his daughter's name, asking anyone who knows anything to come forward, a mother who has kept a page alive online for years, a sister who says Kortne is with her every single day. They have not had the mercy of a grief with an ending. They have had to grieve and hope and search all at once, indefinitely, which is a kind of endurance most of us are never asked to imagine. And they have carried it not by retreating into private sorrow, but by gathering publicly and even joyfully on a creek in the summer sun and insisting that the world remember not only how Kortne was lost, but how she lived. But there has also been frustration, and it would be dishonest not to name it. In the summer of 2025, as the 13th anniversary approached, a local television station reached out to both the Lebanon County District Attorney and the Palmyra Police Department for any update on the case. Neither returned the calls or the emails. Now, to be fair, there are legitimate reasons why investigators go quiet on an open case, and silence to the press is not the same as inaction behind the scenes, but to a family that has waited 13 years, that silence lands hard. It feels, from the outside, like a case that has slipped down the list, like a daughter who's being forgotten by the very system that was supposed to find her. Whether that feeling is fair or not, it is real, and the family lives inside it. As it stands today, the disappearance of Kortne Stouffer remains an open, unsolved case. She's listed in the National Missing Persons databases, catalogued by the FBI, a case number attached to a young woman who was once the life of every party she walked into. No one has ever been charged. No one has ever been publicly named as a suspect. No trace of her has ever been found. No remains, no belongings, nothing to say where she went after that knock on the door went unanswered in the dark. She would be in her 30s now. She would, in all likelihood, have built the life her mother said she was still figuring out how to build, the beauty work, the animals, maybe a family of her own. Instead, she exists in the terrible suspension of the permanently missing, neither declared gone nor able to come home, held in place by a silence that someone, somewhere, has the power to break and has chosen, for more than 13 years, not to. So where does that leave us tonight with Kortne's story? It leaves us where it has left everyone who has ever looked closely at this case, with a nearly complete picture of a single terrible night and a blank space where the ending should be. We know she was there. We know the police were at her door. We know she left behind everything a person needs to live. And we know that in the quiet, after that final unanswered knock, she slipped out of the world she belonged to. And no one has been able to say how, or why, or where she went. The case is open. No one has been charged. And the truth of what happened to Kortne Stouffer is still held, most likely, in the memory of at least one living person who has never told it. But if there is one thing this channel believes, it is that a person is never only the mystery of how they were lost. Because behind the case file, beyond the timeline and the theories and the search departments, was a real young woman. Kortne was a daughter and a sister, a farm kid who grew up barefoot in the tall grass outside Harrisburg. She was someone who worked 3 jobs and still found the energy to be the loudest, warmest person in any room. She was someone who made her living making people and animals feel cared for. She wore peace on her skin and reggae in her heart and a tattoo of a pistol blooming into flowers on her side, hard things turning soft, which was, in the end, exactly who she was. She loved the water, she loved her dog, she loved her family, and they loved her, and they have never once stopped. Have you ever wondered what it is that cases like this one are really asking of us? Maybe it is only this: to pay a little more attention to the people around us, to take the young woman who is loud and difficult and having a bad night just as seriously as anyone else, because she is someone's daughter and she is someone's whole world. To remember that behind every cold case is a family still setting a photograph on the kitchen table each morning, still floating down a creek each summer, still waiting for a phone to ring, and to refuse, in whatever small way we can, to let the missing become invisible. So tonight, as you think about Kortne's story, try to remember her not for the mystery of how she vanished, but for the brightness of how she lived. Picture her on the creek, in the sunlight, drifting slow and easy with the people who loved her, the loudest and the brightest thing on the water. That is who she was. That is who she still is to everyone who is still looking. Her story is not finished. Somewhere, someone knows how it ends. And until they find the courage to say it, the rest of us can do the one thing that is still in our power to do. We can keep her name spoken and her face seen and her memory awake. Kortne Stouffer was 21 years old, and all these years later she remains missing and loved and quietly, stubbornly waited for by everyone who has refused to stop hoping she finds her way home.